Power is never proven by the room you occupy, but by what stops working when you leave it. At 9:42 p.m., snow moved sideways against the glass skin of Crestwood Meridian Tower, 38 floors above West 57th Street, turning the city below into a blur of white headlights, wet asphalt, and blue winter light. The executive floor smelled faintly of espresso, cedar polish, and the cold metal breath of machines hidden behind locked doors. Beyond the windows, Manhattan glittered like money pretending not to be lonely. Marisol Vane arrived without hurry. She wore a tailored midnight blue coat over a cream silk blouse, her hair swept low and elegant, her pearl earrings catching the pale light from the ceiling panels. The lobby guard had stood straighter when she passed, not because she demanded attention, but because the building seemed to understand her before people did. Her black access card clicked once against the private elevator reader, soft as a verdict. The doors opened. Crestwood Meridian had traded near a $4.8 billion market capitalization that spring, a number Julian Crestwood repeated in interviews the way other men repeated wedding vows. A financial news panel had called him the polished architect of modern financial technology, though anyone inside the company knew the architecture had a quieter author. Marisol had written the first risk map on a borrowed Dell laptop in a Queens apartment 12 years earlier, with radiator heat ticking beside her and 2 scholarship letters folded under a coffee mug. Julian had framed the magazine covers. She had built the system beneath them. On the 38th floor, assistants in charcoal suits moved quickly between glass rooms, balancing tablets, garment bags, and silver trays of sparkling water nobody had time to drink. A $12,000 imported Italian conference table reflected the city lights in thin, expensive streaks. At the end of the hall, outside Marisol's private office, 2 facilities workers were unscrewing her brushed brass nameplate from the walnut door. One of them avoided her eyes. She stopped walking. The new plate sat on a black velvet pad. Sloan Everly, Executive Image Strategy. The letters were still warm from the engraver, too bright, too new, almost childish against the old wood Marisol had chosen herself. Inside the office, her framed systems map had already been removed from the wall and leaned face down beside a white leather sofa she had never liked. Julian stood near the window in a charcoal bespoke suit, one hand in his pocket, his profile turned toward the falling snow as if the city were an audience waiting for him to speak. Beside him, Sloan Everly smiled in a champagne silk dress, holding a glass she had not earned and a confidence she had borrowed from proximity. She looked around the room the way a guest looks at a hotel suite upgraded by mistake. "It has better light," Sloan said. Julian turned, smooth and camera-ready, his cufflinks flashing under the recessed LEDs. "Marisol, this is part of the rebrand," he said, gentle enough for witnesses, cold enough for marriage. "The company needs a softer public face near the center of operations." The words settled between them like frost. Through the glass, taxis crawled along 57th Street, their yellow roofs dulled by snow, while a siren passed somewhere far below and vanished into the avenues. Marisol looked at the empty rectangle on the door where her name had been, then at the dashboard glowing on the wall behind Julian, still running on architecture he had never cared to understand. She did not blink. The room waited for anger, for embarrassment, for some small human fracture Julian could later describe as emotional. Instead, Marisol removed her leather gloves one finger at a time and placed them neatly over her wrist. "I see." Julian's mouth tightened, because restraint had always made him feel less powerful. He glanced toward the assistants, then toward Sloan, performing calm the way he performed loyalty, success, and devotion in photographs. "You'll still have an office," he added. 32 has been prepared. 32 was 3 floors below legal, 5 floors above investor relations, and nearly 80 feet away from the secure data corridor. It was not a transfer. It was a message wrapped in corporate language. Sloan tilted her head, pretending sympathy while studying Marisol's coat, her pearls, her stillness, searching for the weakness she had been promised. Marisol turned slightly toward the windows, where the city lights trembled through the snow like distant fire trapped under ice. The glass was cold enough that she could feel it from 6 feet away. Her marriage had become the same thing. Polished, tall, expensive, and freezing from the inside. Julian smiled for the room. We move forward tonight. The new brass nameplate caught the ceiling light first, then Sloane's smile, then Julian's reflection, in that exact order, as if the room itself had decided what mattered least. At 9:56 p.m., the snow thickened outside the 38th floor, pressing Manhattan into a silent grid of red brake lights and silver rooftops. The heat inside the office was set to 72 degrees, but Marisol could feel the cold moving through the glass, through the walnut door, through the careful distance her husband had placed between them. Julian laughed softly beneath the warm recessed lights, his white shirt glowing, his bespoke lapel sharp, his hand resting lightly behind Sloane's chair like a public statement. But in the darker corner beside the server access alcove, Marisol stood still, half lit by the blue pulse of the security panel, her face calm enough to make every witness uneasy. She did not compete with spectacle. Sloane stepped behind the imported Italian desk and ran her fingers across its polished edge, admiring the view of Central Park South blurred by snowfall. "So this is where all the important decisions happen?" she asked, her voice airy, almost musical, the kind of tone designed to make ignorance sound charming. Julian smiled wider, enjoying the performance, enjoying the injury he could pretend was strategy. "Not all," he said, "but enough." Marisol looked past them to the wall monitor, where the Crestwood Meridian client dashboard rotated through private banking clients, pension analytics, sovereign fund reports, and compliance alerts tied to $900 million in active risk exposure. The screen was beautiful in the way dangerous things are beautiful when the person admiring them does not know how they work. A green line moved across the interface, quiet and alive. Adrian Vale entered at 10:01 p.m., carrying a slim oxblood folder stamped with the crest of Harrow and Blythe LLP, the firm that handled Crestwood Meridian's governance architecture. He was 63, silver-haired, precise, and dressed in the kind of Navy suit that made wealth look less like decoration and more like jurisdiction. He paused when he saw the new nameplate on the desk. "Mr. Crestwood," he said. Julian's smile barely moved. "Adrian, good. We're simply updating access protocols for Miss Everly." The attorney's eyes shifted once toward Marisol, then to the black executive access card lying beside Sloane's champagne glass. "That may implicate the core data stewardship covenant, the executive access revocation clause, and the legacy system's integrity seal." Sloane blinked, still smiling because she had not yet understood that the room had changed temperature. Julian's jaw tightened by a fraction. "It's an office, Adrian." The only sound was the soft scrape of the attorney's fountain pen as he opened the folder and drew one line beneath a paragraph Julian had signed 8 years earlier. Outside, a gust of snow slapped against the window, sudden and white, while far below on West 57th Street a delivery truck hissed through slush beside the curb. Marisol watched the pen move. Sloane lifted the black card and tapped it lightly against the desktop. Once, twice, 3 times, as if power could be tested by rhythm. Julian gave a low laugh under the golden light. Almost playful, almost cruel, but in the dim reflection near the glass wall, Marisol's profile remained motionless, her eyes fixed not on her husband, not on the mistress, but on the card. The card was not the key. It was the mistake. "She'll need full access," Julian said. "Brand analytics, investor sentiment, client heat maps, the executive archive. Whatever Marisol used, she can use." Adrian did not sit. "Full access requires competency certification, fiduciary clearance, and data governance approval under the Operational Risk Authority mandate." Julian exhaled through his nose, the first visible crack in his polish. "She has my approval." Adrian closed the folder with care. "Your approval is not the controlling authority." For the first time, Sloane's smile thinned. The city lights trembled behind her, 1,000 windows shining through snow, while the office hummed with servers locked behind a biometric door 12 feet away. Marisol finally moved, not toward Julian, not toward Sloane, but toward the desk where her access card rested near the glass. She picked it up between 2 fingers, studied the matte black surface, then placed it flat on the walnut. The only sound was the cold snap of the titanium card as she bent it cleanly in half. No one breathed for a second. Julian stared at the broken card, offended less by the gesture than by the fact that he did not understand it. Marisol turned to Adrian. "Prepare the access review." Adrian nodded once. under the Beneficial Control Escrow Protocol. Her voice remained soft, and the Founder Origins source code reservation. Sloane looked from one face to another, suddenly aware that the office she had been given was full of doors she could not open. Julian stepped forward, his smile gone now, the warm light making his anger look expensive and small. Marisol, don't turn this into something dramatic. She reached for her gloves. I didn't. Marisol did not leave immediately, because dignity, unlike anger, knows the value of timing. At 10:09 p.m., the snow outside Crestwood Meridian Tower turned heavier, whitening the ledges of the glass curtain wall and blurring the blue lights of police cars crawling along West 57th Street below. The office smelled of cedar polish, warm electronics, and Sloane's expensive perfume, a polished floral note that did not belong among servers, audit trails, and billion-dollar liability maps. Julian stood beneath the amber ceiling lights with a practiced little smile returning to his face, as if the broken titanium card on the desk were only a wife's dramatic flourish. But in the darker strip beside the biometric access panel, Marisol stood perfectly still, her cream blouse catching only the faint blue blink of the security system. She let silence do the measuring. Adrian Vale placed the Oxblood Harrow and Blythe folder on the desk and removed a single cream page embossed with the Crestwood Meridian governance seal. The paper was thick, almost ceremonial, the kind used for documents meant to survive boardrooms, divorces, and men who thought signatures were decoration. Sloane watched the page as if it were a menu in a language she had pretended to read before. Julian gave a soft laugh. Adrian, surely we're not turning office assignments into a fiduciary event. Adrian adjusted his glasses. You already did. The sentence landed colder than the snow against the glass. Marisol walked to the far bookcase, where her system's map had been removed and left face down against the wall. Behind it, in the shallow drawer beneath the lowest shelf, sat the old black fountain pen she had used when Crestwood Meridian was still 3 rented desks, one overdrawn operating account, and a prototype no investor wanted until her risk engine produced its first clean forecast. The pen had cost $49 at a stationery store near Columbia, and she had kept it because it reminded her that poverty had taught her precision before wealth tried to teach her performance. She lifted it once. Then she set it back. Julian watched from the warm light, amused again now that she was touching old things, convinced memory made her weaker. But in the corner shadow, reflected faintly in the glass, Marisol's face remained calm, detached, almost merciful. She was not collecting souvenirs. She was leaving evidence behind. Adrian slid the cream page toward her. If you authorize the review, the Executive Access Revocation Clause activates at midnight. The Operational Risk Authority mandate will require a competency audit for any new executive-level data user. The Founder Origin source code reservation will also restrict derivative use until provenance is verified. Sloane's fingers tightened around the champagne glass. Julian's smile hardened. She cannot suspend the operating layer of my company. Marisol looked at him for the first time that night. No. Outside, the city flickered through the storm, penthouse windows shining above streets soaked in gray slush, while the tower's HVAC whispered overhead like restrained breathing. She uncapped the fountain pen, and the gold nib caught one clean line of light. Adrian placed a small brass signing weight on the corner of the page, engraved with the initials M.R., her maiden name hidden in plain sight for years on documents Julian had never bothered to read. The only sound was the thin scratch of the fountain pen crossing the signature line, turning a marriage insult into a governance action. Marisol Rains Vane. The name looked quiet on the page, but every letter carried authority. Sloane stared at it, her silk dress glowing softly against the expensive darkness, her borrowed office suddenly too large around her. Julian stepped closer, lowering his voice. You are making a mistake. Marisol blotted the signature once with a square of ivory paper. I made mine years ago. He flinched, because she had not raised her voice, and that made the wound more exact. She returned the pen to the drawer, not as a keepsake, but as a final object left in the room he had mistaken for hers. Then she removed her gloves from the desk, folded them together, and walked toward the door where Sloane's new brass nameplate shone too brightly against the walnut. At 10:17 p.m., the private elevator opened with a soft silver chime. Adrian stood aside. Julian remained under the warm lights, smiling at no one now, while in the darker corridor Marisol paused only long enough to look back at the office, the broken card, the unsigned confidence draining from Sloane's face. "Revenge is noisy," she said. "This is consequence." The elevator doors closed without hurry. At 12 a.m., the first lock did not sound like power, but like absence. The wall dashboard in Sloane Everly's new office flickered once, dimmed to gray, and replaced $900 million in live risk exposure with a single line requesting steward authorization. Outside Crestwood Meridian Tower, snow hammered the glass in hard silver sheets, and Manhattan below looked sealed under ice, its avenues glowing with brake lights, hotel marquees, and the cold blue pulse of emergency vehicles moving through slush. Julian stood beneath the warm executive lights with a thin smile he had not yet surrendered, one hand braced on the imported Italian conference table, pretending the silence of the system was merely a technical delay. But across town, in a dark town car moving east on 57th Street, Marisol sat motionless beside a rain-specked window, the city lights sliding over her face like quiet evidence. She had already left the room. At 12:03 a.m., the client analytics portal froze, then the investor sentiment dashboard, then the executive archive. Sloane clicked the mouse with increasing force, her champagne silk sleeve brushing the desk, as if expensive fabric could persuade encrypted systems to obey. A junior analyst whispered that the sovereign fund heat map had lost authorization for 12 active portfolios, including a $240 million pension-linked allocation scheduled for review at 7:30 a.m. Julian laughed once, too lightly. Reset the credentials. Nobody moved with confidence. Adrian Vale stood near the door with the oxblood folder under one arm, looking not surprised but weary, the way a man looks when foolishness finally reaches the paperwork. "The reset function is subordinate to the core data stewardship covenant," he said. "Executive override is suspended pending the competency audit." Julian turned sharply. "I am the chief executive." Adrian's voice remained level. "Not for that layer." The words made the room smaller. In the town car, Marisol watched snow gather along the black rubber edge of the window while her phone remained face down in her lap. She did not call a journalist. She did not text a friend. She did not explain herself to anyone who had required public humiliation before noticing her value. Under the golden office lights, Julian smiled for the frightened assistants, telling them Crestwood Meridian had survived worse. But in the blue darkness of the moving car, Marisol sat still, her gloved hands folded, already beyond his performance. She let the system speak. At 12:11 a.m., Adrian placed a second document on the table, a 7-page notice issued under the Founder Origin source code reservation and the Legacy Systems Integrity Seal. The notice identified 6 proprietary modules created by Marisol before Crestwood Meridian's Series B financing, including the Meridian Risk Spine, the Client Provenance Engine, and the Escrowed Identity Bridge. Each module could remain in use only if operational custody stayed with an approved steward. Sloane stared at the document, her eyes moving over words she could not convert into influence. Julian's smile broke at the corner. "This is marital leverage." Adrian shook his head. "This is asset provenance." The only sound was the precise tear of a removable archive seal as Adrian opened the certified notice and laid the signed authorization flat beneath the conference room light. The cream paper did not tremble. The embossed initials M.R. caught a narrow white reflection from the ceiling and held it like a blade. At 12:18 a.m., Northbridge Capital's compliance desk sent the first inquiry, followed by Hawthorne Private Bank, then the risk insurer in Boston that underwrote Crestwood Meridian's enterprise liability up to $75 million. The questions were polite, expensive, and fatal. Who held operational authority? Who controlled source code continuity? Who had approved the new executive data user? Julian reached for the black card that was no longer whole, then remembered it lay bent in 2 clean pieces beside Sloane's glass. His fingers stopped over empty walnut. Marisol's town car passed Park Avenue, where the towers burned with late-night light and the snow turned every ledge white. Her driver asked if she wanted to go home. She looked at the city for one more second, calm as a closed file. "Not yet," she said. At 12:24 a.m., In a rented legal suite on Lexington Avenue, a notary slid a steel stamp across a mahogany desk toward her. Marisol removed her gloves, signed the final wrist transfer instruction, and placed the page under the seal. The only sound was the heavy press of the notary's stamp biting into paper, making the consequence official. By 1:07 a.m., the rented legal suite on Lexington Avenue had become brighter than Julian's tower, though it held no marble lobby, no champagne, and no wall of cameras waiting to flatter a billionaire. Snow scraped against the narrow windows in pale diagonal lines, and the city lights outside glowed through the storm with a tired amber patience, reflecting off wet taxi roofs and the black glass of nearby office buildings. Marisol sat at a mahogany table with her coat folded over the chair beside her, her posture still, her face lit by a single brass desk lamp and the soft blue glow of a secure laptop. She did not look like a woman who had lost an office. She looked like a woman reclaiming a jurisdiction. Across Manhattan, Julian remained under the warm designer lights of Crestwood Meridian's 38th floor, forcing a short laugh while telling his panicked executives that the system interruption was temporary. But in the quiet legal suite, in the darker hour before dawn, Marisol signed each page with the composure of someone who had stopped asking to be recognized and started being obeyed. The split between them was exact. Adrian Vale stood at the end of the table, connected by secure video, his face framed by the dim conference room glass behind him and the frozen dashboard reflected over one shoulder. "The wrist transfer instruction is accepted," he said. "The beneficial control escrow protocol is active as of 1:09 a.m. Eastern Time." Marisol nodded once. Beside her, a younger attorney from Harrow and Blythe, Denise Holleran, placed 3 folders in a precise line: Core Data Stewardship Covenant, Founder Origins Source Code Reservation, and Rains Equity Systems Formation Authority. The last folder bore no Crestwood name. It bore hers. Rains had been her mother's name, printed on rent receipts, scholarship forms, and the lunchbox labels Marisol had carried through public school in Queens before Wealth learned how to pronounce her. The new entity was not hidden offshore, not buried in a shell structure, not designed for revenge dressed as cleverness. The structure had been prepared for months, incorporated cleanly in Delaware, registered for social finance technology, and funded through a protected operating reserve that Julian had once dismissed as his wife's compliance safety net. Denise slid forward a document with a pale green tab. "This authorizes the initial capitalization of Rains Equity Systems at $38.6 million, drawn from the segregated reserve governed by the Beneficial Control Escrow Protocol, not from Crestwood Meridian's operating cash." Marisol read every line. "And the mission lock." Denise turned one page. "Embedded under the Social Impact Governance Charter and the Protective Access Initiative." At Crestwood Meridian, Sloan stood in Marisol's former office, her champagne silk dress catching the gold ceiling light, while her reflection floated helplessly across a dead dashboard. Julian smiled at the room and called for confidence, but his eyes kept cutting toward the broken titanium card like a man watching a door disappear. In the legal suite, Marisol sat in calm shadow, a city block away from the nearest camera, turning one page at a time beneath the brass lamp. Her silence was not emptiness. It was structure. At 1:16 a.m., Denise opened the Rains Equity Systems Charter and read the first provision aloud. The company would provide legal financial infrastructure for women locked out of marital assets, family businesses, private ledgers, trust distributions, venture equity, and digital records they had helped build but were never allowed to control. It would offer forensic access mapping, ownership education, escrow review, shareholder rights preparation, and protected data custody. It would teach women to read the rooms where their lives were being decided. Marisol's eyes paused on one sentence. "No beneficiary shall be denied knowledge of assets materially shaped by her labor, inheritance, fiduciary position, or intellectual contribution." Outside, snow gathered on the sill. Inside, the page waited. The only sound was the clean pull of a black lacquer fountain pen cap as Marisol opened it and signed the charter under her maiden name. Marisol Rains Vane. The ink settled dark and final. At 1:22 a.m., Denise notarized the document. Adrian countersigned the governance notice from the tower, and the secure laptop emitted a soft confirmation tone as the entity registration packet transmitted to the state filing system. Marisol did not smile. She looked at the name on the screen, Rains Equity Systems, and thought of women in apartments, clinics, small offices, churches, shelters, and boardrooms, all being told they were emotional because they had finally asked for proof. Back at Crestwood Meridian, Julian raised his voice for the first time that night, ordering someone to get her on the phone, while Sloane quietly stepped away from the desk she had wanted so badly. Under golden lights, he laughed too late and too loudly, trying to make fears sound like command. In the cool shadow of Lexington Avenue, Marisol closed the final folder with 2 fingers, her expression untouched. The only sound was the soft click of the brass clasp locking over the Rains charter, and with it, the empire Julian had flaunted became smaller than the company she had just built. By 6:18 a.m., Crestwood Meridian no longer looked like a tower built by certainty. Snow had hardened along the window ledges of the 38th floor, and dawn came slowly over Manhattan in a pale gray wash, turning West 57th Street into a corridor of slush, headlights, and exhausted delivery vans. The executive floor still smelled of espresso gone bitter, printer heat, and the dry panic of people who had not slept. Julian Crestwood stood under the same warm designer lights, tie loosened by half an inch, laughing softly into a speakerphone as if confidence could be performed at volume. But across town, in the quiet Lexington Avenue suite, Marisol sat in the blue darkness before sunrise, reviewing the Rains Equity Systems filing receipt without touching her coffee. She had slept less than an hour. At Crestwood Meridian, the first serious damage arrived in polite language. Northbridge Capital sent a 6:22 a.m. notice suspending its $240 million pension-linked analytics review pending proof of operational custody. Hawthorne Private Bank followed at 6:31 a.m., invoking enhanced diligence under its Enterprise Data Reliance Standard. At 6:44 a.m., the Boston risk insurer paused Crestwood Meridian's $75 million technology liability coverage until the company could identify the authorized steward of the Meridian risk spine. No one shouted. The numbers did it for them. Julian pressed both palms to the imported Italian conference table and smiled at his executives, the kind of smile he used on financial television when markets trembled. "These are routine questions," he said. Adrian Vale stood near the frozen dashboard with the oxblood folder closed against his chest. "No, Julian. These are exit signals." Sloane Everly sat in Marisol's former office, her champagne silk dress wrinkled at the waist now. One shoe slipped half off beneath the desk. The new brass nameplate outside the door still shone, but everything behind it had gone quiet. The client heat maps, the sovereign fund model, the executive archive, the encrypted access layer she had called too complicated. At 3:12 a.m., she refreshed the screen again and again, each click smaller than the last. At 6:52 a.m., the monitor returned the same message, steward authorization required. In the tower's golden light, Julian gave another thin laugh and told the room the market would admire decisive leadership. In the cool shadow of Lexington Avenue, Marisol read an email from a women's legal aid network in Queens, then marked it for priority onboarding under the Protective Access Initiative. His empire was trying to look stable. Her new company was already finding its first purpose. At 7:03 a.m., Denise Holleran called from Harrow and Blythe with a clean update. "The Social Impact Governance Charter has been accepted. Rains Equity Systems is active. The Beneficial Control Escrow Protocol is fully segregated, and the Core Data Stewardship Covenant remains enforceable unless Crestwood Meridian passes a third-party operational audit." Marisol looked toward the window, where snow softened the roofline of a neighboring building and the first orange edge of sunrise touched the glass. "And Julian?" Denise paused. "He has requested emergency injunctive relief." Marisol closed the laptop halfway. "On what basis?" Denise's voice stayed precise. "Reputational harm, executive disruption, and marital bad faith." Marisol almost smiled, but did not. "File the response under asset provenance." At 7:18 a.m., Adrian read the insurer's second notice aloud in the Crestwood boardroom. The policy suspension now referenced the Operational Risk Authority mandate, the Executive Access Revocation Clause, and potential breach of stewardship controls resulting from unauthorized executive reassignment. The phrase unauthorized executive reassignment landed directly on Sloane's office, on the brass plate, on Julian's decision to treat governance like furniture. Sloane stood in the doorway, pale and furious, holding her phone like it might rescue her from vocabulary. "Why is everyone acting like I did something wrong?" Julian turned toward her too quickly. "Not now." The only sound was the brittle crack of Sloane's champagne flute stem as she set it down too hard against the glass shelf, splitting the delicate crystal beneath her fingers without spilling a drop. She stared at it, offended by the break, as though even objects had begun refusing her. At 7:26 a.m., Crestwood Meridian stock opened down 11% in pre-market trading after a leaked partner pause note reached 2 finance newsletters. By 7:41, it was down 18. By 8:05, a board member from Chicago demanded an emergency call and asked one question Julian could not answer without saying Marisol's name. "Who controls the core system?" Julian looked toward Adrian, then toward the dead dashboard, then toward the empty rectangle on the door where Marisol's name had once been. The room had never felt so expensive or so useless. Across town, Marisol placed the Reigns charter into a slim black folio and fastened the clasp with quiet care. The only sound was the soft click of the folio closing over her maiden name, while the city outside thawed slowly under a sky the color of steel. By 9:12 a.m., the snow had thinned into a hard silver drizzle, and the windows of Crestwood Meridian Tower reflected a city that had already begun judging the day. West 57th Street moved below in slow lanes of black sedans, yellow cabs, delivery bikes, and slush-dark crosswalks, while the upper floors of Manhattan burned with cold morning light. Inside the 38th floor boardroom, Julian Crestwood stood beneath the warm recessed LEDs with a forced smile and a fresh silk tie, speaking into a 12-person emergency call as if charm could refinance failure. But 5 miles south, in a quiet legal aid conference room on Lafayette Street, Marisol sat still beneath fluorescent light, listening to a single mother explain how her husband had locked her out of a family business ledger. He performed control. She restored it. At 9:19 a.m., Northbridge Capital joined the board call with no small talk. Their senior managing director, Alan Mercer, appeared on the screen from a glass office in Chicago, the skyline behind him washed white by lake-effect snow. He did not mention Sloane, the marriage, the office, or any headline that could be dismissed as gossip. He only asked, who currently holds operational custody over the Meridian Risk Spine, the client provenance engine, and the escrowed identity bridge. The room went quiet enough for the HVAC to sound loud. Julian smiled. Those assets sit within Crestwood Meridian. Adrian Vale lowered his eyes to the audit packet. Custody and location are not the same thing. Sloane stood near the doorway in her champagne silk dress, no longer glowing, no longer floating, one arm folded over her waist as if the room had become colder than the glass outside. The brass nameplate on Marisol's former door remained painfully bright, but every person on the floor now looked at it as evidence, not decoration. At 9:27 a.m., Hawthorne Private Bank requested a live stewardship attestation under its Enterprise Data Reliance Standard, and the Boston insurer demanded written confirmation that no executive access had been reassigned without fiduciary clearance. Julian laughed lightly under the golden lights, telling them the matter was being harmonized internally. But in the shadowed legal aid room downtown, Marisol reviewed a woman's frozen payroll account, circled a hidden ownership clause, and wrote 3 precise words in blue ink: request beneficial records. One empire was learning vocabulary too late. Another woman was learning it just in time. At 9:34 a.m., Adrian placed the audit log on the boardroom table. It showed Sloane Everly's attempted access requests at 12:04, 12:08, 12:11, 12:17, and 12:23 a.m. Each denied because she lacked competency certification, fiduciary clearance, and stewardship approval. It also showed Julian's override attempt at 12:31 a.m., rejected under the Executive Access Revocation Clause. A board member from Chicago leaned toward his camera. "Julian, did you authorize a non-certified executive to assume proximity control of a restricted operational environment?" Julian's smile held for 1 second too long. It was an office reassignment. Adrian's answer was quiet. It was a governance breach. The words traveled through the screen like a blade wrapped in silk. Sloane stepped backward, her heel touching the threshold of the office she had wanted, and for the first time, she looked less like a mistress and more like a witness who had signed nothing but still stood beside everything. At 9:41 a.m., Northbridge suspended all pending allocations, including the $240 million pension-linked review and the $110 million municipal risk analytics expansion scheduled for the following quarter. Hawthorne Private Bank issued a formal pause. The insurer moved from suspension to conditional withdrawal unless a third-party operational custody audit could be completed within 10 business days. The numbers did not fall. They walked away with manners. Julian's face changed by degrees, the smile first, then the jaw, then the eyes. Outside, the drizzle cut thin lines across the glass, and Manhattan's lights faded under a sky the color of wet steel. The only sound was the soft rip of a board chair removing Julian's printed agenda from its leather folder and tearing it once across the middle before placing both halves on the table. No one called it symbolic. They did not have to. Downtown, Marisol closed the legal aid file at 9:48 a.m. and slid it back to the woman across from her. "Ask for the records before you ask for mercy," she said. Her voice carried no bitterness, only instruction. In the tower, Julian turned toward Sloane, searching for loyalty and finding only calculation. She looked at the dead dashboard, then at the cameras gathering in the lobby feed, then at her phone lighting up with unread messages from people who had once called her brilliant for wearing the right dress near the right man. "Maybe I should leave before this becomes public," she whispered. Julian stared at her as though betrayal had finally learned his language. Across town, Marisol rose from the table, her black folio under one arm, while morning traffic hissed beyond the frosted window. The only sound was the small click of the conference room door closing behind her, and somewhere uptown, an empire discovered that admiration leaves faster than access. 5 years later, at 7:36 p.m., rain fell over lower Manhattan in clean silver lines, washing the glass towers along VC Street until the city looked less like money and more like memory. The Global Social Finance Forum occupied the top 3 floors of the Whitman Exchange Center, 61 stories above the wet sidewalks, where black umbrellas moved below like ink drops beneath the white glow of traffic lights. Inside, the air smelled of orchids, wool coats, polished stone, and expensive coffee served in cups too small for anyone who had ever worked through fear. Marisol Raines Vane stood near the stage in a deep oxblood evening suit, her pearl earrings soft against her skin, her posture straight, her face calm beneath the lights of a room that had finally learned to say her name correctly. She had not become louder. She had become undeniable. Across the ballroom, Julian Crestwood stood beneath a warmer pool of chandelier light. Older now, his once perfect smile carefully repaired for donors and cameras, laughing at the edge of a circle that no longer centered him. But beside the dark glass wall overlooking the rain-bright city, Marisol stood in stillness, reading the final briefing note for a $72 million women's asset access fund. He had kept the habit of performance. She had outgrown the need to watch it. Raines Equity Systems now operated in 14 states, with satellite legal financial clinics in Queens, Atlanta, Detroit, Oakland, and Houston. It had helped 18,600 women map hidden equity, recover beneficial records, understand trust distributions, challenge blocked payroll accounts, and secure data custody over businesses they had built from kitchens, clinics, back offices, and marriages that called their labor support instead of ownership. The company's platform ran on a governance framework Marisol had refined after Crestwood Meridian collapsed into a forced restructuring. The terms were quiet: Protective Access Initiative, Beneficial Records Retrieval Standard, Fiduciary Visibility Protocol, Domestic Enterprise Equity Review. They did not trend on social media. They changed lives. At 7:49 p.m., the moderator introduced her as the founder of Raines Equity Systems, architect of the nation's leading protected access infrastructure for women in financial displacement. The applause rose gently at first, then filled the glass room with the kind of respect no PR team could manufacture. Julian clapped too, his smile fixed under the chandelier, while rain blurred his reflection into the window behind him. Marisol walked to the podium without hurry. The microphone light turned green. "Access is not a luxury," she said. "It is the beginning of truth." The room became very still. She spoke not of revenge, not of scandal, not of the night her office door received another woman's nameplate. She spoke of ownership ledgers, source provenance, escrowed voting rights, marital enterprise exposure, and the quiet harm of being excluded from records one's labor had made valuable. She described a woman in Queens who found her name missing from a bakery she had run for 17 years. She described a nurse in Atlanta whose retirement share had been buried under a private operating ledger. She described a widow in Houston who recovered control of licensing royalties because someone finally taught her how to request the right document with the right authority. Under the chandelier lights, Julian smiled thinly for the people glancing his way, pretending admiration did not feel like judgment. But at the podium, framed by rain and city light, Marisol stood in composed shadow, giving other women the vocabulary he had once dismissed as background noise. Her poise did not accuse him. That made it worse. At 8:06 p.m., the forum chair presented her with the Arden Civic Finance Medal, a heavy crystal rectangle etched with her maiden name and the words stewardship through access. The object caught the skyline behind her, splitting it into blue, gold, and rain-streaked white. Marisol held it with both hands, not as proof of triumph, but as evidence that her silence had not been emptiness. Julian looked down when the cameras turned toward her. He had once called her careful. Now an entire room called it leadership. After the applause, a staff member brought a final document for the new Rains Access Fund, the closing authorization for its first national grant cycle. Marisol placed the medal on the podium, uncapped a black fountain pen, and leaned over the page. The only sound was the smooth sweep of ink across the signature line, releasing $72 million toward women who would never have to beg for records in rooms built from their own labor. When she looked up, Julian was waiting near the side corridor, alone beneath a narrow wall sconce, his expensive suit darker at the shoulders from rain. For the first time in years, he had no entourage, no mistress, no board, no camera-ready explanation. Marisol walked toward him with the crystal medal in one hand and the signed authorization in the other. Outside, lightning opened briefly over the Hudson, and every window in the tower flashed white before returning to black. Julian Crestwood waited beside the side corridor at 8:19 p.m., where the chandelier glow ended and the darker service lights began, looking smaller than the man who had once handed away Marisol's private office, as if a room could erase the woman who made the company breathe. Rain moved down the glass wall behind him in clean vertical lines, and lower Manhattan shimmered beneath the storm, all wet rooftops, river lights, and passing sirens softened by 61 floors of distance. His suit was still expensive, his watch still discreet, his posture still trained by old interviews and boardroom photographs, but the confidence had been worn thin around the edges. Marisol stopped 6 feet away, holding the crystal medal in one hand and the signed Rains Access Fund authorization in the other. He tried to smile. "Marisol," he said, and for once her name did not sound like an accessory in his mouth. Behind him, donors laughed under warm light. Waiters crossed the marble with silver trays, and the city outside kept flashing in rain-blue reflections. Behind her, the ballroom still murmured with respect she had earned without borrowing his surname, his office, his cameras, or his permission. Julian looked at the medal, then at the document in her hand, then at the woman he had mistaken for replaceable. "I heard what you said tonight," he began. Marisol did not answer. He swallowed, as if the next sentence cost more than any settlement. "I was wrong about the office. About Sloan. About the system. About you." The words were clean, almost rehearsed, but the regret underneath them was not. 5 years had taken the gloss from his arrogance and left the structure visible. A man who had loved admiration more than loyalty, publicity more than judgment, possession more than partnership. He looked toward the rain-dark windows. "I thought giving her that office was a branding decision. I thought the database, the models, the client archive, the risk engine, all of it, would follow whoever I named." Marisol's expression remained calm. It didn't. Julian lowered his eyes. "No, it followed the authority. The sentence hung between them with the quiet precision of a final audit. Crestwood Meridian had never recovered from the night he gave Sloane Everly the private office and tried to extend her access to restricted operational systems. The core data stewardship covenant had stopped her at the threshold. The executive access revocation clause had blocked Julian's override. The founder origin source code reservation had frozen the modules he had called company property until their provenance was verified. And the operational risk authority mandate had done exactly what Julian never believed possible. It revoked their database access. Not by sabotage, not by rage, not by a dramatic deletion, by law, governance, authorship, and the authority Julian had signed away because he never respected the woman holding it. He looked back at her now with the heaviness of a man who had finally learned the difference between ownership and access. Sloane left before the restructuring vote, he said softly. She said she never understood what I had pulled her into. Marisol's gaze did not move. She understood the office. He almost smiled, but the attempt failed. Yes. Beyond the corridor, applause rose again as another award was announced, warm and distant, belonging to a world that had moved forward without him. Julian stepped half a pace closer, then stopped himself, remembering too late that proximity was not permission. I'm not asking for the company, he said. I'm not asking for the old life. I know I lost that, but I wanted to tell you I understand now. You were never behind me. You were holding the whole structure upright. Marisol looked at him for a long second, not with cruelty, not with longing, but with the steady compassion one gives to a closed chapter that no longer has the power to reopen itself. The rain tapped the glass like soft fingers. The crystal metal in her hand caught a flash of lightning and threw one brief, white line across the floor between them. I forgive you, Julian, she said. His face changed at the word forgive, hope rising too quickly, like a man mistaking a doorbell for an invitation. Marisol saw it, and the kindness in her eyes became firmer, cleaner, more complete. I forgive you because I will not carry your ignorance as interest on a debt I never owed. My peace is not a board asset, marital property, or something remorse can reclaim. He closed his hand around nothing. Could we ever start again? For the first time that night, Marisol smiled, small and unshaken. She placed the signed Rains Access Fund authorization inside her black folio, the same careful gesture with which she had once closed the first charter on Lexington Avenue. The only sound was the soft click of the clasp sealing over her maiden name, final and elegant beneath the rain-lit glass. She looked at him with the dignity he had once confused for silence. Access denied. Then she walked back toward the ballroom, where women were waiting to speak with her about records, ledgers, shares, payroll accounts, and doors they had been told were not for them. Julian remained in the corridor, surrounded by polished stone and reflected rain, understanding at last that forgiveness could release him without returning him anything. Outside, the storm softened over Manhattan, and the city lights blurred into gold and blue beneath the glass, not cold anymore, just distant. Some endings do not arrive with ruin. Some arrive as a closed folder, a quiet room, and a past that no longer has permission to follow. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.